demonstrate a significant contribution to structural engineering, and the regulations state that should include some or all of the following qualities. So showing increasing levels of responsibility within the practice of structural engineering. So that's technical aspects for projects, a significant personal contribution to research or teaching, something along those lines. You must show a commitment to the profession through service and involvement in relevant professional bodies. Clearly, the best way of doing that is by serving within the institution of structural engineers. So is that on a regional group level? Do you serve on the UAE Regional Group Committee? Do you serve on HQ panels or committees? Are you an examiner? Are you a reviewer? How are you engaged in the day-to-day operations of the institution, and how do you support the profession in doing that? You must demonstrate that you're a specialist or an innovator within your field. So if you have a particular niche area where you can say, wow, I'm a world-leading expert on this, well, clearly you're going to satisfy that criterion. You must demonstrate leadership skills. And it's really all about seniority. Fellowship is about that leadership, about that seniority, about being at a level within the profession where it's not just your technical ability. That's already been proven because you are already a chartered structural engineer. It's moving beyond the technical ability and to a broader range of skills, which with the emphasis really being on leadership, seniority, etc. You must have 5 years of senior professional experience. And how do you demonstrate that? You will write a report of approximately, it says there 1,000 words, but it's normally 1,000 to 1,500 words. You will show how you have satisfied all the different criteria that we're looking for. And then finally, you will have demonstrated continuous professional development over the last 5 years. So that's the criteria. And ultimately, that's what we're looking for when you're applying for the grade of fellowship. So if we look at this in detail, the second part is if you're not in membership of the institution at the time of admission, you may be nominated through the eminent persons route. So there are 2 routes to membership. The first route, as I've discussed, is for those individuals who are already chartered structural engineers. So you've already proven your technical competence, you're IStrcutE, you're now going through the fellowship route. But there is another option, and it is called the eminent persons route, sometimes known as the direct route. Essentially, this is for individuals who are, well, to put it bluntly, giants within the structural engineering world. They are doing things, working on projects, leading in ways where it is absolutely quite clear that they should be a fellow of the institution. Now, the fact is they're not a member of the institution, but nonetheless, we feel that they would support the institution and support the profession by being a fellow. So essentially, we would look at those individuals, we'd look at their career, we'd look at what they've done, and their ability to materially advance the profession of structural engineering. And if we feel that they've met all the criteria, we will invite them to be a fellow of the institution. So that's an invitation from the board. It's not something that you can apply for. It's quite rare that these invitations are issued. Clearly, it is for people who are literally at the top of the profession, but it is another route whereby an individual can become a fellow of the institution. So to summarize, currently, you must be IStrcutE or IStrcutE. So that's member or associate. As of the 31st of December 2023, that will be restricted to IStrcutE only. That's the route if you're already a member. If you're not already a member, but you are, very, very senior and eminent within the profession, then the board might look at your CV and what you've done in your career and may invite you to become a fellow directly, even though you're not previously, you will not have previously passed the chartered exam and being a member of the institution. So they're the options that are available. So application process. The first thing to do is actually have a look on the institution's website. When you look under membership, you'll get a drop-down list and you'll see all the different grades of membership, and you'll have details there as to the eligibility criteria and how you go about applying for that particular grade. Now, clearly, you would click on the fellowship grade. You want to find out about how you can move towards that particular grade of membership. And the important thing is down at the bottom of the slide there, you'll see there is a grey button called guidance. That's the one that you go for. Click on the guidance document, open it out, and it sets out in some detail what we're looking for from a candidate and how you can make your application. So, what are we looking for? Leadership and seniority, a commitment or contribution to the development of structural engineering, and personal responsibility for projects and staff. We would ask you to submit a report of around about 1,000 to 1,500 words, which sets out your 5 most significant achievements, 5 most significant achievements that show leadership and seniority, that show a contribution to the development of the structural engineering profession, that show personal responsibility and responsibility for projects and staff. So 5 key achievements, all contained within that report of 1,000 to 1,500 words, demonstrating those 3 key attributes. And that's what the application and professional review panel are really going to be looking for. It's probably the most important part of your application. Now, there are other parts of your application. We need evidence of 5 years of CPD. Now, some candidates look at this differently and say, I submit an annual return to the institution each year. I'm simply going to take my last 5 years of annual submissions and I'm going to attach that as part of my fellowship application. And that's fine. If you want to do it in that way, submit your last 5 years of annual returns, that's great. If you haven't submitted annual returns for the last 5 years, it's not a problem. It doesn't mean you have to wait for 5 years, 4 years, 3 years down the line until you've got that 5 years of annual returns. You will simply write a very short report, maybe 3 or 4 pages, setting out what you have done over the last 5 years in terms of your CPD. So what activities have you undertaken? What benefit and learning have you derived from those activities? What's your plan for the following year? So you can look at this in 2 different ways. If you've got your 5 years of annual CPD returns, you can attach them, that's great. Or you can just write a short report setting out what you've done over the last 5 years and the benefits that have been derived from your CPD. Up to you. We clearly want a CV. Now, this doesn't have to be War and Peace. We certainly don't want a 10-page CV or anything like that. It should be 2-3 pages setting out who you've worked for, your levels of responsibility, the basics of your career. You need an organizational chart. This is quite important because your organizational chart should show your place within the organization and, more importantly, should really reinforce your seniority. In an ideal world, you should be able to show how you've managed people and projects within that organizational chart. Now, the key point, the organizational chart, many people think, that means I have to work for a big company and have tons of people working underneath me. That's not the case. The regulations have been deliberately crafted to make routes to fellowship accessible for all. There is nothing in the regulations that say you have to work for a multinational company. There's nothing in the regulations that say you have to work on projects of a particular size. So you can get sole practitioners who are members of the institution, but they are applying for fellowship. You can get people from a research or an academic background who are applying for fellowship of the institution, or you can get people from the big companies, the multinational companies that operate around the world, and they equally can apply for fellowship of the institution. But the organizational chart is a good way of showing where you are within your organization, or if you don't have lots of staff underneath you, where you are in terms of the projects that you're working on, perhaps people and colleagues that you oversee that may not be employed by you, but might be part of a bigger project that you're working on. So think about it quite creatively, and remember, at all times, you're trying to show seniority, leadership, eminence within the profession. So think carefully about how you can use your CPD, your CV, your organizational chart to demonstrate the attributes that we're looking for. You must have two supporters. One at least must be an IStrcutE fellow. You can have two IStrcutE fellows, that's fine. Equally, you could have perhaps a fellow from another institution, so possibly the ICE or someone senior. I think really what we're looking for here is people who know you. They've got to be able to talk about your experience. They've got to be able to say, yes, we feel that you have satisfied the criteria to become a fellow of the institution. The reason why it's important that they know you, they're going to be sent a questionnaire, and we ask them to complete that questionnaire, and it will say, how do you know the candidate? How long have you known the candidate? Can you confirm that the candidate has the competence, the seniority, the leadership, etc., etc.? So some people are tempted to find supporters who are, shall we say, big hitters within the institution. Let's get the president to sign my fellowship application form. That's absolutely great if you know the president. If you don't know the president, and more importantly, if he or she doesn't know your work, then actually they're not the best person to support your application. Find someone who knows you and can actually fill in that questionnaire and say, yes, I can confirm that this candidate has the right seniority, leadership, the right experience in order to be a fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers. You'll fill in the application form, you'll submit all of this documentation online, and at that point in time, you'll pay the application fee for fellowship. So quite a straightforward process. So submit online. Your application will then be considered by the application and professional review panel. The panel meets on a quarterly basis. We send the papers out to the panel probably around about 2 weeks in advance of the meeting. It gives the panel members ample opportunity to look through each of the submissions, to see if you've met the criteria, to see if you're the right sort of individual to become a fellow of the institution, to ask any questions that they might have. So you always got to remember, if the panel is meeting, say, 8th of February, and that's a usual time, you need to make sure you get your application in probably a month to 2 months in advance. Why? We need to go out to your supporters. We need to get them to fill in the questionnaire. We need all of that information to come back. And then we need 2 weeks prior to the meeting to get it out to the panel members so that they can read your submission. So if you're aiming for maybe the 8th of February, 2 months in advance. The next application and professional review panel meeting will be towards the end of May. There'll be another one at the beginning of September and another one towards the end of October. So they're the dates that you need to be aware of, if you want to make your application. Now, the panel will look at your submission, and there's probably 3 potential outcomes. The best one is they think you're the best thing since sliced bread, and they say, brilliant, we accept your application. We think you've satisfied all the criteria. They will make a recommendation to the membership committee, which meets about 2 to 3 weeks after the panel meeting. They'll make a recommendation. Yes, this individual should be transferred through to fellowship of the institution. Great, nice and simple. The institution's happy, the candidate's happy, perfect world. Another extreme, your application is declined, and the panel says, actually, maybe you've just applied too early. Maybe you haven't met the criteria. Maybe there's some queries that they've got, and they might say, we can't accept your application, but please submit additional documentation to show X, Y, Z. So that's another option. The halfway house is the interview. Sometimes the panel will say, well, we can't quite accept it, but equally, we don't want to decline it. There are a number of grey areas there. So let's call the candidate in for an interview. We'll conduct the interview. We'll ask the questions where perhaps we've got some doubts, or perhaps it's less than clear whether the candidate has satisfied the criteria. You'll have the interview, and then the report from that interview goes to the next panel meeting, at which time the panel will make a decision as to whether to accept your application and recommend your transfer through to fellowship, or decline your application and say, sorry, not now. you need to perhaps think about applying a year or two down the line. So there are a number of options that the panel has when they first look at your application. So the submission guidance, if there is one thing that you take away from this presentation, it should be read this document in detail. It does tell you everything that you need to do in order to become a fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers. Within the document, there is a page which sets out 9 different examples or ways in which you might choose to show your leadership, to show your seniority, to show your contribution to the profession. Now it says, there in bold text, there are several ways you can demonstrate a significant contribution, commitment, and leadership in the field of structural engineering, such as, towards the end of the slide, it will say, the above examples are for guidance only and are not intended to be exhaustive or prescriptive. So you still have free rein as to how you show your leadership and your seniority. However, the guidance note gives you some really good examples of how you can demonstrate you've satisfied the criteria and how you link it to your 5 most significant career achievements. So let's look at those in a little bit more detail. So the first option is to demonstrate an increasing level of responsibility for the practice of structural engineering, including significant personal involvement in the technical aspects of increasingly challenging projects, or demonstrate an acknowledged experience in a technical subject area. So sometimes a candidate will say, I've worked on a range of projects. I'm able to show how those projects have become technically more challenging, how they've really stretched me, how I've had to do research in order to answer the briefs and answer the problems that have been put to me. So that's one way of demonstrating that particular criterion. Other individuals have said, I'm an expert on climate change. I'm an expert on historic structures. I'm an expert on seismic. And they've been able to show that they really have an acknowledged expertise in that particular technical subject area. So it's up to you to say, how do I demonstrate that? Is it because you really have that sort of technical knowledge in a niche area and it will be very easy for you to demonstrate that? Or do you just want to show a range of projects that have become technically more challenging and complex? Another option, having hold a significant or influential role as a designer for a major project of national or international significance. This isn't always one that the candidates will go for, but if you are lucky enough to have worked on a project, for example, something that maybe has won the Structural Awards Supreme Prize or another award from the Institution of Structural Engineers, I think you're quite within your rights to say that project is of national or international significance. I played a significant part as the designer in that project. And so that's quite understandably one of my 5 most significant achievements in my structural engineering career. That's great. Third option, having taken a significant role in the design or construction of technically complex and innovative works. Similar in some respects to number 1, you're showing complexity, technical challenge, that sort of thing. Number 4, a significant personal contribution to research in structural engineering or the teaching of structural engineering. And again, the emphasis here is there are a range of ways in which you can demonstrate that you've satisfied the criteria that we're looking for. And we deliberately designed these examples to be inclusive, to be accessible, so that people from whatever background, from whatever career experience they've got, if you've got seniority, if you've got leadership, there should be a way for you to demonstrate that such that you can transfer through to fellowship of the institution. Have a significant role in the development or delivery of engineering education and training. Most importantly, not just engineering education and training in the formal setting of a university or college. We're not saying you have to be a teacher, but have you done something within your own company where you've been involved in the education of more junior colleagues, where you've had responsibility for mentoring your colleagues perhaps running a training program within your organization, perhaps running a professional review interview or examination preparation courses within your company, all of which are designed to support more junior colleagues and ensure that they have access to wise counsel from more senior engineers. That would be a good way of satisfying that particular criterion. The sixth example is promotion, management, or administration of the structural engineering profession, either through the institution or a similar body. Again, ideally, if you can show that from an institution of structural engineers perspective, serving on the regional group committee, serving with HQ, interviews, exams, going into universities, giving talks and encouraging people to become student members of the institution, all of that counts. But equally, it counts if you've done it for another institution. So clearly, if you've been working out in the UAE for many, many years, and you've been involved in, I think it's the Society for Engineers, you might have done all of those activities, but for the Society of Engineers. In a previous employment, you might have been in Australia, so you might have done all of these activities for the Engineers Australia. So it's a case of we're not overly picky here. You can show how you have enhanced the profession of structural engineering by being involved in the institution or a similar professional body. The seventh example, exceptional leadership skills. So have you undertaken work or initiated projects within your company where you have been responsible for motivating and inspiring people within your organization? Where you're given the responsibility of being, right, you're the head of climate change, and I want you to drive through climate change within the organization and motivate and inspire people and make sure the culture that we're looking for is embedded within the organization. Did you do that for structural safety? So have you championed structural safety in your organization and inspired people to behave in a different way and develop the cultures and behaviors that we're looking for? So examples of those sorts of initiatives and those sort of leadership skills would be ideal. A significant portfolio of projects, including financial outcomes. So if you go back to the previous slide, we're talking about technical issues, complexity, increasing levels of challenge. Here, it's less about the increasing levels of challenge or the innovation. It's more about, have you worked on a lot of projects and have you had responsibility, including financial responsibility, for a range and breadth of projects? So again, you don't have to be the expert building the Burj Khalifa. There's very few of them in the world. But you might have a significant range of projects that you've worked on over your career where you have held significant levels of responsibility, not only for the design, but for financial outcomes as well. Having played a leading role in the conception and development of new systems or techniques. So have you taken research and embedded it into practice? Have you created new techniques, new systems which have enhanced the profession of structural engineering? Now, as I said at the very outset, these are 9 examples. You shouldn't consider them to be, the tick list, the checklist. It's not a case of you having to do 9 of them. You may have done 9 of them. You may have done a few of them. You may have done other things in your career that will demonstrate the leadership, the seniority, the contribution to the profession that we're looking for. And those things might not be included on the list of 9 examples that we've got there. So you have complete freedom to decide how you want to demonstrate those attributes and what you're going to include in your 1,000 to 1,500 word report. By and large, the vast majority of candidates will look at those 9 examples and say, I can take 5 of those. They can be my 5 most significant achievements in my structural engineering career. And I can write about those 5 most significant achievements. And I can say clearly how I've demonstrated leadership, seniority, et cetera, et cetera. Now, when you're writing your report, a couple of important things to remember. You are applying for fellowship and you are telling the application and professional review panel that you have the seniority and the leadership that we're looking for. If you're going to do that, well, tell them very clearly. Use the sledgehammer to crack the nut. Don't leave any room for doubt or ambiguity, etc. Make it very, very clear that I have exceptional leadership skills because I have done X, Y, and Z. I have been involved and led a significant portfolio of projects, including financial outcomes. And here's the details of the projects that I've run, the size of the projects, the value of the projects. Don't be conservative. Don't hide your light under a bushel. You need to sell yourself in this exercise, and you need to convince the application and professional review panel that you have satisfied the requirements that we're looking for. So be positive and be confident. Do not qualify statements. Do not say, well, I've had some experience in leadership, and I've had some involvement in promotion, management, or administration. If you go in there and you're not convinced that you should be a fellow, then the panel are unlikely to be convinced. So you've got to be confident, and you've got to be positive, and you've got to talk about you. Do not talk about your company, and do not talk about the wider profession. What have you done? You're going to be the fellow. Your company isn't going to be the fellow. So talk about your personal achievements, and don't be shy in selling yourself and putting yourself forward. Barriers to fellowship. There is, or at least was, a perception that fellows have to work for big companies. That is absolutely not the case. So over the last few years, thankfully, we have seen a huge variety and a very diverse range of candidates coming forward. And not all of them have been from big companies. We've had sole practitioners, we've had candidates coming from academia and research, but of course we still have those candidates who are coming from the big companies. But you don't have to be working for a major company. You don't have to have worked on multi-million-pound projects. There is still a way for you to demonstrate your seniority in the 9 examples that I've previously described as a sole practitioner or someone working in a smaller company or in academia. There is a perception, and I think a misperception or misconception, that fellows are from a certain demographic. You have to be old, you have to be male, maybe have less hair than me. Again, absolutely wrong. When you look at the number of younger candidates coming forward, younger members, far better gender split now, far better split in terms of international fellows coming forward. So don't listen to the old stereotypes, which perhaps might have been prevalent 10, 15, 20 years ago. That's no longer the case. Fellowship is accessible to all if you can show the seniority and leadership that we're looking for. The other barrier to fellowship, bizarrely, is a risk of failure. Sometimes candidates, and I think engineers generally tend to be quite a conservative bunch. So you're not always going to be, yeah, I'm there, I've got the right seniority. And sometimes you wait and you say, oh, maybe I need another couple of years. Or when I look at some of those fellows, I'm not as good as them. So maybe I shouldn't apply. And the biggest problem, I don't want to go out and get an application form and get 2 supporters to sign my application form. And lo and behold, 6 months later, I meet those supporters and they say, oh, Darren, you sent in your application for fellowship. How did it go? And you're in the awkward position of saying, oh, didn't go well. I wasn't successful in becoming a fellow. And I can understand no one wants to be in that position. So sometimes there is a reluctance to actually take the leap and make that application for fellowship. And we do offer a service here. We allow you to make a preliminary application. So this is where you send in your CV, you send in your organizational chart. If at all possible, you send in your 1,000 to 1,500 word report and you say, this is who and what I am. This is how I think I've satisfied the criteria for fellowship. Do you think I'm in the ballpark? Now, this is unofficial. We send that documentation to 2 members of the panel and we say, can you have a look at this candidate's draft submission and give us some feedback? And as you can imagine, you get a range of feedback. Sometimes a reviewer will say, wow, this candidate is exceptional. tell them to make an application, it's absolutely great. Sometimes the reviewers will come back and say, okay, good, strong candidate, but there's several areas where there needs to be greater clarity. And they'll provide you with some useful feedback saying, look at this, address that issue, change your organizational chart, perhaps take, in a recent case, submit a couple of organizational charts. This particular candidate used to work for a very, very big company and used to have numerous staff working under her. She then became a sole practitioner. So the organizational chart would be very, very different. But this candidate submitted 2 organizational charts to show at one point I did have a lot of staff working underneath me, and it's important you know that, and I had that responsibility for projects and staff. Now my career's changed. I have my own company, a different set of pressures, a different set of skills and abilities I've had to develop. But here's my organizational chart for my current employer. That's fine. And you can get that sort of feedback through that preliminary application process, improve your application before you go forward to the formal application. And of course, every now and again, you will get some feedback from the reviewers, and they'll say, you know what, Darren, you need to wait a year or two. You're not quite there. We don't think it's worth your while making an application now. Most importantly, this is an unofficial review. So it's not binding in any way, shape, or form. If the reviewers say, yeah, you should make an application, there is still a possibility that the panel will not agree and that you will not be transferred through to fellowship. Equally, you might find the reviewers say, oh, you should wait a year or two, but you decide, to hell with it, I'm going to submit my application. And the panel might say, no, the candidate's fine. We're going to elect them to fellowship. So it is an opinion from 2 members of the panel, but it's not binding. You can choose to accept the advice that they're giving you, or you could choose to ignore it and proceed in the way that you see fit. But most candidates who go through this particular process find it beneficial. It gives them, more often than not, some assurance that they are in the ballpark, and it gives them the confidence to make the application and some assurance that they've got a chance. So increasingly, the preliminary application process is being taken up by candidates who just want to make sure that they're not wasting their time in making an application for fellowship. And fourthly, there was a view some years ago, wow, it takes an age to make an application, and there's all this documentation, and then I've got to go and have an interview. No, it's a CV, which you all already have. It's an organizational chart, which I would imagine the vast majority of you already have. Your CPD records, pretty sure most of you have CPD records, whether it's for the institution or whether it was with your company, you'll have a record of your professional development. If you're going to spend time, it's in drafting the 1,000 to 1,500 word report, but it's a 1,000 to 1,500 word report about your career. There's not a lot of research that has to go into that. So we've tried to streamline the process. We've tried to reduce the volume of paperwork that you have to submit. And most importantly, there is no absolute requirement for an interview. 5 years ago, everyone was interviewed. That's not the case. The panel will now make the decision, and only if there are some areas of doubt will they ask for the candidate to come in and be interviewed. So we're trying to make the process as accessible, and streamlined as possible. So hopefully that will assure you that actually what many people perceive to be barriers to fellowship are not really barriers at all. We are more accessible, we are more diverse, we have streamlined the process. The standards haven't changed, and I think that's an important point. You still need to satisfy the requirements that we're looking for, but the process has been streamlined, and so it should be a more straightforward procedure that you have to follow. So I think that concludes, that does conclude the presentation. Declan, I'm sure you have a load of questions even coming in as I was speaking. Fire away.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks very much, Darren, for a very informative talk. It's good to encourage people to get that further bit of recognition that they deserve and to get their membership transferred to fellowship. It's also good to see quite a few people logged in tonight. We've had 21 people join the talk. And the good news, Darren, is there was 21 people here at the beginning of the session, and there are still 21 people here, which is a positive.
Well, how many of them are still awake, Declan? That's the key issue.
Yes. I'm going to start with the first one, and we're going to take it easy at the beginning. It's actually not a question. It's a warm welcome to Darren Byrne from Mohammed Aldar. So thank you, Mohammed. Thanks,
Mohammed. And considering you're a fellow, Mohammed, I really do appreciate the fact that you've taken your time out to join the talk.
Yes. Okay, so the first question is, it's about the commitment, demonstrating a commitment to the profession. They've just said relevant professional bodies are only the IStrcutE.
Relevant professional bodies. Now, I'll be honest with you, Declan, clearly, if you've shown that contribution to the Institution of Structural Engineers, clearly that's our preference. Not only because we like to support the institution, but you want to be a fellow of this institution. So there is a logic that says you should be involved in this institution. But again, we recognize that people change and things change within individuals' careers. Sometimes you're working in a part of the world where there isn't a regional group and where you couldn't engage. Since COVID, clearly technology has meant people can engage far more because you've got Teams and Zooms and those sorts of ways that you can participate in meetings. But we recognize that hasn't always been the case, and some members haven't had the opportunity to engage with the Institution of Structural Engineers. That's fine. The most important issue is that they have contributed to the profession in some way through some professional body or organization. So if it's been through another institution, ICE, Engineers, Australia, the Society for Engineers within the UAE, all of that will count because it's showing an advancement of the profession. So we're quite comfortable to take a range of experiences with a range of professional institutions.
Okay. I think there's just another very similar question further down, which you may have a similar answer. So we'll go to that. It just says, development and contribution to education. If you were a reviewer for another profession, would that count?
Yeah, I mean, another engineering profession. Clearly that shows, again, you've been involved, you're giving back to the profession, you're helping younger engineers in develop and pursue professional qualification. So yes, that would count. I'd want to see probably a bit more. I think the candidate should be thinking then, how can I talk about not just the reviewing that I've undertaken, but have they been involved in mentoring candidates, in encouraging and supporting candidates through that process, in educating candidates? The reviewing is one part of it, but if you've got that broader involvement, that puts you in a stronger position to show that you've demonstrated that commitment through that particular example.
Okay, thank you. The 5 years of CPD, is that after you become IStrcutE?
Yes. So
okay.
We have you have the continuum of lifelong learning from the moment you enter the world to the moment you exit the world. But we at the institution divide professional development into 2 periods. Everything you do leading up to a professional qualification is your initial professional development. It's taking you towards a professional qualification like IStrcutE. Once you get that professional qualification, everything thereafter is continuing professional development. So when we say we want 5 years of CPD, we want 5 years of professional development post-professional qualification or post-chartership. Now, that should fit in quite nicely for a lot of candidates, because the vast majority of candidates will be perhaps gaining chartership around about 30 or so. If we're saying that the minimum requirement or expectation is that you're around about 35 when you become a fellow, that's the 5-year gap. Now, it's a good question, though. None of these things are absolute. So I wouldn't want a very senior engineer who happened to come to the institution quite late in their career, passed the chartered member exam 3 years ago, and saying, well, I am a fellow, really. I'm senior. I've got the leadership. Everything I'm doing is at the fellowship level, but I've only got 2 years of post-chartership CPD. That wouldn't be a barrier. You put in 5 years of CPD, we'd recognise you were a member 2 years ago, but the reality is the application professional review panel look at this on an holistic level and say, yeah, the candidate is smashing it out of the park. We're not going to worry about the fact that they've got 5 years, but for the majority of candidates, you would expect 5 years of CPD post-chartered membership.
Okay, like there are a wide range of specializations you can go into in structural engineering, and that'll be looked at holistically.
Absolutely. I mean, we want to be inclusive. We want to be accessible. So I'd hate to think that a candidate who is in a good and a strong position thinks, oh, I'm not going to make a submission. Make your submission and argue your case. You know, the panel will look at it and they'll make the judgment. Just make a strong case.
Yeah. Okay. Should you, or can you mention the company names?
Oh yeah, absolutely. In fact,
the CV.
I don't think I've ever seen a CV that didn't mention the company names. So I think that would be quite strange. Tell us who you've worked for. Tell us your title of your role, how long you were there, some of the projects that you've worked on, some of the responsibilities that you've had. As I said, you know, a lot of the candidates that we see might have 20 years of a working career. Well, yeah, the panel has to read your submission, so they don't want to read War and Peace. So limit it to a few pages, but yeah, highlight the projects, the seniority, the companies that you've worked for. That's fine. A standard CV, but really focusing on how can I show my role and my level of seniority within that CV?
Okay, thank you. Dania Paulson, who you may know, she's just sent a message saying she's listening from Australia. It's 2 a.m. and she's actually still awake.
Clearly lots of cups of coffee in that particular situation.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
The next one, 1,000 to 1,500 words. Can you please elaborate on size of pages, etc., if there are any restrictions?
We don't go into things like font size or, you know, the number of pages or anything like that. We need to do that sometimes when candidates are submitting their portfolios for their professional review interview, because sometimes the candidates will try and throw the kitchen sink in there and we get huge submissions, and that's not helpful. But you can rest assured, no one's going to do a word count and say, I'm sorry, you've got 1,501 words and we're not accepting your application. But equally, we would urge the candidate to be sensible, because again, the professional review panel might be looking at 15 fellowship applications in a given meeting. You know, they're individuals who are volunteering their time. They expect people at this level to be concise in what they're saying. So try and stick within the 1,000 to 1,500 word limit, but no one is going to do a word count and, you know, say, sorry, you're outside the 1,500 maximum limit and that's it. You know, that's never going to happen, but just be sensible.
Yeah, okay. Okay, I've got 2 questions from, I think, the same attendee. I am the owner of a structural engineering consultancy firm. It's got 100+ engineers, significant contribution to bridge and energy sector, and his company is 20 years old. If 70 of his engineers join the institution as graduate engineers, can he be invited to be a member? So I guess in summary, it's sort of saying he's contributing to the institution by encouraging graduate engineers to join. Is there anything that where he could become somehow recognized?
Interesting one.
Yes.
I think really, I'm assuming the individual is not already a member of the institution, in which case you're looking at different grades of membership that they may be interested in. So certainly, they can become a grade, if they've got academic qualifications, they could become a graduate. If they don't have academic qualifications in structural engineering, they might decide to become an affiliate. I suspect what this individual is asking is, could they become a senior member like a fellow? Now, if they're not already a member, the only route to become a fellow is then through the eminent persons route or the direct fellow route. Now, that won't be based on the size of your company, and it won't be based on how many of your graduates have joined the institution. That's purely based on, are you at the top of the game when it comes to structural engineering? As direct fellows, you might be looking at one a year, might get an invitation from the institution. And if I say people like Bill Baker, so Bill designed the Burj Khalifa, et cetera, no one was going to argue that Bill was an exceptional structural engineer. Clearly, he hadn't been involved in the institution. His career was in North America rather than the UK. So he never joined the institution as a younger engineer. But the board took the view that's the sort of person who should be a fellow of the institution. We're not going to ask him to take a professional review interview, and we're not going to ask him to sit the 7-hour exam, because I'm sure he would have told us thanks, but no thanks. So we made him a direct fellow. Now, if the individual who's posted that question, if you're working at, I'm not saying you're Bill Baker, that's an extreme case, but if you can show that you've got that level of seniority, that level of responsibility, and you have contributed in that way, then maybe the direct fellow route is an option. And I think that's probably, where you're looking at. The other option is if you're not actually a qualified structural engineer, and you obviously own the company, but if you're not actually a qualified structural engineer, the other way is honorary fellowship. Now, I haven't covered that previously in the presentation because this is about structural engineers becoming fellows. But there is honorary fellowship. Now, honorary fellowship would be for an individual who's senior within the built environment, perhaps, but not a structural engineer, or they give something else to the institution, maybe a patron. So probably the best known honorary fellow was Prince Philip. He was a patron of the institution, an honorary fellow of the institution. Martin Powell, our previous chief executive, was not a structural engineer, but he's an honorary fellow of the institution. So I think it's a case of, if you're a structural engineer and you're at the top of your game, you might be looking at eminent persons route to fellowship. If you're not a structural engineer, then honorary fellowship might be an option. But I have to be honest, both of them are by invitation. You can't apply. You need someone else to actually put your name forward on your behalf and say, you know what, I think Darren's a great guy and Darren should be a direct into fellowship or an honorary fellowship. And we insist on that because we don't want any embarrassment or we don't want any ill feeling if the board decides, no, I'm not going to offer Darren direct fellow or honorary fellow. We don't want any embarrassment. So if there are people who feel that you should be an honorary fellow or a direct fellow, then it's up to them to contact the institution, make a submission and say, we think this individual should be a fellow. And then it's up to the board to decide whether or not they issue the invitation. But yeah, I'm quite happy to talk to you if you want to discuss that outside the meeting, and perhaps we can have a separate Teams meeting. You're more than welcome to email me and I can take you through those processes in a little bit more detail.
Yes, great, thank you. This question, how can an employer identify or differentiate fellow certificates issued by the IStrcutE for members who got the membership through different routes other than the standard 7-hour exam plus PRI.
Say that again, Declan.
Yeah, so I think how can an employer identify or differentiate fellow certificates, fellowship, I guess, issued by the IStrcutE for members who got the membership through different routes other than the standard route? Now, my understanding is perhaps, I think we just need to clarify, you have to be IStrcutE, or you usually have to be IStrcutE, then you get fellowship, so that's a higher grade. So I guess if an employer, potential employer, saw one certificate that said fellow FIStrcutE and one certificate that said IStrcutE, would he know the difference?
Well, clearly, I mean, I think, taking your point, if it's a different grade, it should be obvious. So if you are a member, your certificate will say member of the Institution of Structural Engineers, Chartered Structural Engineer. If you're a fellow, it will say fellow of the Institution of Structural Engineers, Chartered Structural Engineer. So that's not the issue. The question actually is very good insofar as the vast majority of fellows have gone through the standard route. So the vast majority. They have the right academic qualifications, they've done their IPD, they've done their professional review interview, they've done the 7-hour chartered member exam, they've become IStrcutE, and then later on in their career, they've gone through the fellowship application process and become a fellow of the institution. And I would probably say 99% of fellows will have gone through that route. There are some who will have gone through a different route. And the different route would have been you've become an associate of the institution, IStrcutE. And then based on your seniority, you've applied for fellowship. Now, associate means you've got the right academic qualifications, you've done a professional review, interview with the institution or an equivalent process, but you haven't done the 7-hour chartered member exam. You're an associate, you're still a chartered structural engineer at that point in time, and you are allowed to go forward for fellowship. You might get one of those every couple of years. But that was a route, and that is a route that will be closed down as of the 31st of December 2023. So we've had some bylaw changes and some regulation changes over the last 18 months, and the board and council took the view, no, fellowship should be restricted to people who have been IStrcutE, and so the route for IStrcutE will be closed. Now, in answer to the question, you cannot differentiate between the certificate. A fellow is a fellow, however they have gained that particular grade of membership. So if you're a fellow through the standard route, your certificate will look in a certain way. If you're a fellow through the IStrcutE route, your certificate will be identical. If you're a fellow through the direct route or the eminent persons route, your certificate will be identical. Why did the institution take that view? Is because ultimately you have demonstrated the criteria to be a fellow of the institution. And you have previously demonstrated the technical ability we were looking for, either through IStrcutE or IStrcutE, or you are so eminent in the world of professional engineering that actually it would be nonsensical to ask you to go back and take an interview and exam. So the simple answer to the question is the fellowship certificate is the fellowship certificate, and you would not be able to differentiate the route that the individual has followed to get that grade of membership. All I can say is 99% of the fellows that you will come across have gone through the standard route.
Okay, thank you. The next question, if you thought that you possessed all the necessary qualifications, approximately how long do you think it would take to achieve fellowship?
Well, the application process, I suppose the first question there is, are you going to go through the preliminary application process first, or you're confident enough just to go for a straight application to the panel? Let me take both scenarios. If you were to send in a preliminary application, we would send that out to 2 panel members, and we would expect to get a reply within around about 4 weeks. and we'd be able to go back to you and give you your feedback. So that's quite a straightforward process. And we try to be quite fleet of foot, turn things around quite quickly, so that you can apply as soon as possible. In terms of the formal application, a lot depends on when you actually make your application. And a lot depends on how quickly your supporters return the questionnaires. So, for example, there was a meeting of the application and professional review panel. The last one was on the 31st of May. Papers for that meeting went out around about the 15th of May. Now, in theory, you could probably get an application in on the 1st of May, and if your supporters were quick and actually got their questionnaires back to us in time, we could probably turn it around in 2 weeks and get you in that agenda for the meeting on the 31st. So 1 month before the deadline. The reality is, if someone's on annual leave, if a member of staff's on annual leave, or if your supporters are on annual leave or they just don't reply that quickly, that means you will miss that 15th of May date for the submission of the papers. That means you'll miss the next panel meeting on the 31st of May. And that means you wait until the next meeting in September, because we can't review your application outside of the panel. So my advice to candidates would be, don't leave it to the last minute and submit 1 month before the meeting date. Submit 2 months before the meeting date. So if you were to get your application in at the 1st of April, for example, that gives us plenty of time to process it. It gives us plenty of time to go out to your supporters and say, come on, hurry up, get these questionnaires back to us. We get everything processed within a 6-week period and you're off to the panel. Now, when you go off to the panel, and again, let's take the 31st of May as an example, the panel might come back and say, you're accepted and we're recommending you for transfer to fellowship, or you need an interview, or actually you're not quite ready. Best case scenario, you're accepted, your application goes to the membership committee meeting, which would have been held 22nd of June, I think it was, about 3 weeks later. And at that point, the membership committee say, yes, we're transferring you to fellowship. So I would expect a candidate submitting an application around about the 1st of April to be elected at a membership committee, probably about 2 to 3 months later. So that's a rough timetable. But as I said, it really does depend on when you make your application and whether you hit the next meeting or not.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Teaching in an engineering institute as a visiting faculty, can that be considered as a value addition or one
Absolutely.
of your achievements?
Yes. So, and again, a really good question there, because you're not saying I'm an academic and that's one of my key achievements. No, what you're saying is I am contributing to the profession because I am involved in a local university and I'm a visiting professor. And there's a whole host of activities. Do you open up site visits to students from the local university? Do you mentor students from the local university? Do you go in and give talks and say to students, you should be student members of the Institution of Structural Engineers? So there's a whole range of activities that shows an engagement with the institution. Going into a university and being a guest lecturer or marking some projects or something like that, all of that is a contribution to the profession and it should definitely be listed.
Okay, thank you. Another question. I understand that the supporters will be contacted for feedback, and this candidate saying that he would like to give a reference to multiple supporters that have supported him on various stages through his career. Who should he give priority to? Like which aspects of the application will be verified through the supporters?
What we're really saying with the supporter is not that you're verifying each of those 5 most significant achievements. What we're really saying is that supporter should know you sufficiently well to confirm to the institution, yeah, I've known Declan for X years, and Declan is a senior engineer and he should be a fellow of the institution. So pick someone who knows you well and can actually confirm, understand what fellowship is all about, and then confirm that, yes, you have met that criteria. It's less about the detail of, can you confirm that Declan worked on that project, or can you confirm that he did go into that university? We're not looking for that level of detail. It's not like IPD where you're getting a mentor to say, yes, he did do that, she did do that, she did. That's not it. We're just saying, can the supporter say that you are at the right level of seniority, leadership, etc., to become a fellow of the institution? So it's more about someone who knows you well and can testify to your career rather than particular elements of your career.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Shapur, which may also be a familiar name.
Hello, Shapur. Yeah. Afternoon.
So can the organization chart be project related rather than company related?
Yeah, I could see that as an option. It all depends what you're trying to demonstrate. And again, a really good question insofar as a sole practitioner might say, I can't show 10 staff that work under me, but I can demonstrate my leadership by showing a range of projects and sizes and complexity, etc. We're happy to, I'll be honest and say that the vast majority of candidates do a standard organizational chart, and here's my boss and here's the 10 people who report to me and I'm somewhere in the middle. That's the norm, but we're open to candidates demonstrating their leadership and seniority in different ways. So if you don't fit that traditional model, fine, not a problem. An organizational chart which shows your leadership in a different way, that's fine, and it can be project-based.
Thank you. Okay, from Zabi, he's first of all thanking for a very informative session. And his question is, with regards to demonstrating the work experience outlined in the report, what is the best way to support our statements? Would we perhaps need to add an appendix, adding relevant paperwork, or would the feedback form from the two supporters be sufficient?
Yeah, the key point here is, I think, again, very useful. This is not a professional review interview. You are already members of the Institution of Structural Engineers. You're IStrcutE, you're a chartered structural engineer. So what does that mean? We trust you. You know, we believe what you're saying. You know, there's no question that we think you're going to try and hoodwink the institution. So there's no need to say, look, I've done X, Y, and Z, and here's a portfolio of work to show that I've done X, Y, and Z. You simply write that 1,500-word statement and saying, this is what I've done. You've then got your two supporters who are saying, yep, Declan's done those things and he's a great guy and he's a senior chap and he should be a fellow of the institution. But you don't need to submit portfolios of work or different appendices to support your statements, because we will take your statements as being truthful. So if there's any gaps or if there's any doubts, well then, okay, maybe the panel might say, can we have a little bit more information about X or Y? Worst case scenario, they might say, let's have an interview with the candidate just to clarify these issues. But you don't need to submit a portfolio of work.
Okay, thank you. Another just a statement. Thank you. Thank you for the very informative talk. And this is going to test your memory. How many fellows are currently in the IStrcutE?
Well, I'm going to, well, look, I could lie here, Declan. I could give you a number and I defy anyone to tell me if I'm wrong. But let me say 1,492. The reality is it's around about 1,500 and it goes up and down.
Yeah.
So I dare say at the last membership committee meeting on the 22nd of June, I think we had about 14 or 15 members who are transferred through to fellowship. So it does change. It's around about 1,500 fellows.
Okay. That sort of, that actually concludes the questions, which were very, very engaging. Thank you, and thank you to Darren for answering them. You might see in the chat box, we just added, just if there's any candidates looking for a mentor to assist on their journey to fellowship, please send an email. There's an email address, ise.sec.gr gmail.com. I know we probably have a few people tuned in from the UAE region. We're quite proud here. We have actually got 8 fellows in the region, in the UAE, and we have at least one in Saudi that we know of. And we have created a group where we have started mentoring candidates that want some assistance or guidance on the journey. So please feel free to send us a message in that email address, and we can assign you a mentor within a week or two. So it brings us to the end of our talk, and again, just a very big thank you to Darren for taking the time to give the talk, which was excellent. And yeah, we'll see you all again at the next CPD talk that we're holding in the region, which will probably be in about 2 weeks' time.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Declan, and thank you one and all for joining us this evening. Thanks very much.
Okay, all the best. We'll bring the session to a close now. Thank you.
Cheers. Bye-bye.